the What Bitcoin Did podcast.
Hi there, how are you all? Welcome to the What Bitcoin Did podcast, which is brought to you by Kraken. And today I've got my second interview with Andrew Poelstra, talking about some of the exciting tech which is coming to Bitcoin. And if you haven't heard my first interview with him, I recommend you check it out. It's definitely one of my favorites. But before that, I've got a message from my show sponsors. So, Kraken, the best exchange for buying and selling digital assets, and it's the only place I now use for buying and selling Bitcoin. They are the only regulated spot and futures crypto exchange, and this week they announced they would be allowing customers to invest in the company. Via Bank to the Future, investors can invest in the future of Kraken with a minimum amount of $1,000. So if you want to find out more about this, you can head over to Bank to the Future, which is BNKTOTHEFUTURE.com. Click on the invest button and you will find out about the Kraken opportunity. And also this week I spoke with the UX team at Kraken. We did a video call and they walked me through some of the exciting new screens for their upcoming mobile app, which is super cool. It looks amazing. I can't wait for them to release that. So yes, that's going to be coming in the future. I can't give you a date at the moment. All I can tell you is that it's pretty cool. So if you want to join me in supporting Kraken, the best crypto exchange in the world, head over to kraken.com, which is KRAKEN.com. And next up is BlockFi, the company which is creating the future of Bitcoin financial services. And they've currently got two products available. You can earn interest on your crypto with their interest accounts, something I've been using, something I've got 20% of my Bitcoin in, which I don't recommend you do the same without doing any of your own research. But I'm looking forward to getting my next payout. It'll be the first time I've held my Bitcoin with them for a whole month. So I will feedback on that. Also, they announced that their interest accounts have over $100 million in assets under management, which is pretty impressive stuff. You can also borrow against your crypto holdings with BlockFi with their crypto-backed loans. And next week, they've got a big announcement coming, which I will be telling you all about on the show. So keep an eye out for that. If you are interested in trying out any of these products, as I said, I recommend you do your own research, but then head over to blockfi.com, which is BLOCKFI.com. Okay, so on to my interview with Andrew. And as I mentioned, if you haven't heard my first interview with Andrew, I recommend you check it out. I met him at the Bitcoin Expo at Boston, and we recorded quite a funny show, actually, one which I did no prep for because it was so technical and I didn't know how it would go. So I didn't do any prep for it, and we just got this kind of amazing, magical interview out of it that I know so many people loved and enjoyed. So when I was in New York for Consensus, I asked him if he would come back on the show, if we could go into a bit more detail on some of the more technical things, and he agreed. And Andrew is definitely one of the smartest people in Bitcoin that I've met, but also one of the easiest people to interview because he explains things in really easy ways to understand, and it's just always a fun interview to do. We cover a bunch of interesting things in this interview. We talk about some of the exciting tech upgrades coming to Bitcoin, including Schnorr Signatures, Taproot and Graftroot, and how this affects addresses. Anyway, as ever, if you've got any questions about the interview, do feel free to reach out to me. And also just some notes on some events I've got coming up. I've got a few that I'm going to be attending. This Sunday, I'm heading over to the Oslo Freedom Forum as a guest of Alex Gladstein. On Monday, the 27th, I'll be hosting a conversation about Bitcoin adoption around the world. I'll be exploring trends in places like China, the Philippines, India, Iran, Nigeria, and Hong Kong. If you are interested in going, you can grab a ticket at oslofreedomforum.com. And if you use the discount code WhatBitcoinDid, you can get 25% off your ticket. The following weekend, I'm going to be heading to Munich for the Lightning Hack Day and also be hosting 2 panels at the Voice of Bitcoin conference, so keep an eye out for that. And lastly, I will be emceeing the Crypto Compare Digital Asset Summit on the 12th of June in London. This event features a great lineup of speakers. It's got a keynote from Andreas Antonopoulos. Also, there'll be Tom Lee, Milton Demers, Gabor Gabex of VanEck. Binance will be there, NASDAQ and UBS, and loads more. There's going to be regulators from the Bank of England, HM Treasury, and the FCA. Tickets are available at the moment, but looks like a busy one. But they have created a discount code for me if you want to go. If you want to buy tickets, head over to summit.cryptocompare.com. And if you use the discount code WBD, you can get 20% off tickets. And they also accept payment in Bitcoin and ETH. Hopefully a bunch of interviews I'll get recorded at these events as well. And lastly, if you are interested in supporting the show, just head over to my website, whatbitcoindid.com, click on the support section. It will explain everything you can do. And I need to say a big thank you to my Patreon top tier sponsor, that is Rise Wallet, a new way into Bitcoin. There are no sign-ups. You scan a card and you are holding Bitcoin. To find out more, head over to risewallet.com. Okay, spoken enough. On to the interview with Andrew. I hope you enjoy it. And as ever, if you want to reach out to me, if you want to ask any questions about the show, my email address is hello@whatbitcoindid.com. Hello again, Andrew. Good to see you again.
Hey, Peter. It's great to be back.
Yeah, so soon. That last show we did was really popular. Everyone loved it.
Yeah. You sent me some Twitter links. I was very happy to see that.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. Perhaps because I had no idea what we were going to talk about. It was one of the first interviews. I came without any questions, and we just rolled with it, and we seemed to get some really great show out of it. So today I've cheated slightly. I've got 5 words to prep for this interview, and 5 things I'm going to ask you to take me through, which will hopefully help other people who want to understand these things. Now, we covered the first one in the last interview, but Peter Willie, is it Will?
I say Willa. Which he doesn't correct me on, but he may have just given up.
I see. I wasn't sure. Is it Willie? Anyway.
It's Willa.
Willa.
Not Willie.
Willa.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if I meet him, I'll ask him. But so he obviously put out a proposal for a couple of new BIPs. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay, and there's a few things within there that we should unpack, but we covered Schnorr before, but let's do it again because I think it's going to go with everything else. So start by explaining what Schnorr is and why it's helpful and good for Bitcoin.
Sure. So Bitcoin today has a scripting language that it uses for controlling the spending of coins, for defining the spending policies. Typical Bitcoin spending policy is just somebody has a public key, they need to provide a transaction with a digital signature associated to that public key. You can also do multi-signatures and whatnot. And there's a primitive in Bitcoin script for checking these signatures. There's something called ECDSA, which is just a cryptographic object that was defined by NIST, I believe, in 1990 as a short, meaning only about 64, depending how you encode it, it's like 73 bytes, elliptic curve-based digital signature. And the reason that this was defined, as opposed to suggesting people use the Schnorr signature scheme, which had been created a couple years before by its supposed inventor, Klaus P. Schnorr. I shouldn't say supposed. His name is on the patent. And this is...
and it's named after him.
And it's named after him. So a Schnorr signature, academically, is the simplest instance of something called a Fiat-Shamir transform. Okay, and this is just a way to take some interactive protocol, in this case, the Schnorr identification protocol. And that really is what Schnorr invented, was a Schnorr identification protocol, which is a way for somebody to prove who they are. A Fiat-Shamir transform turns that into something non-interactive. So now you can just write down something proving that you are the holder of some secret key. And in doing so, you have the ability to insert some auxiliary data, some arbitrary message. And so this turns this from just a proof that you are somebody, that you hold some key, into a signature on some data saying, I hold this key and I attest that this message is something that I want to sign. So it's a very simple, elegant, easy to describe, easy to implement protocol with a lot of nice features. But Schnorr put a patent on this, which expired in 2008. And so it was basically unusable. Anybody who wanted to use these short elliptic curve-based digital signatures were either forced to pony up money to Schnorr or go somewhere else and use RSA or something like that.
Hold on, if it was 2008, why didn't Craig Wright put it into Bitcoin?
That's very good. That's a very good question. It would appear the inventor of Bitcoin had no idea that it existed, which is strange because Craig Wright has insisted that he does know about it. So perhaps somebody is lying here, And I don't want to say that Craig Wright is a fraud and there's multiple instances of this and that he didn't invent Bitcoin. But the fact of the matter is that Craig Wright is a fraud who didn't invent Bitcoin, and there's multiple instances of this.
I mean, these are your own opinions and they do not represent what Bitcoin did. What Bitcoin did would never, ever call Craig Wright a fraud.
Absolutely not.
Never.
Yeah, I'm not aware of what Bitcoin did ever calling Craig Wright a fraud.
Never, ever has the podcast What Bitcoin Did ever said Craig Wright is definitely a fraud.
Yep. No. Certainly not saying that Craig Wright is definitely a fraud.
So we're agreeing that we have a different opinion on Craig Wright being a fraud.
We agree.
Okay, so...
All right. So Schnorr patented this digital signature scheme. In response, NIST defined, I think it was Daniel Krowitz at NIST. I hope I got the right name there.
I see that guy's name on Twitter quite a bit.
Yeah, he's on Twitter now. He's a cool guy.
He gets into some debates with people.
Yeah, he's one of those old school cryptographer cypherpunk people who is really engaged today. And who gets excited that because of this cryptocurrency thing, like there are lots of people interested in cryptography. Like relative laymen who are interested in cryptography. I think that's a really cool thing.
Very cool.
For people doing this stuff in the 90s when it was really much more of a niche thing that was very difficult to get any penetration into the public. But NIST defined a alternate short digital signature scheme. And it was not nearly as simple, it was not as easy to describe, it was not as easy to argue security for as was Schnorr. Because Schnorr signatures, by being the simplest, most obvious thing, like by definition, you couldn't get something else that was as simple and obvious. And you'd think that would be grounds for there not to be a patent on it, but I'm not the patent office, and they apparently disagree. So ECDSA came into being. By the time 2008 rolled around and the patent had expired, there were no implementations of Schnorr signatures anywhere. A few years later, in 2011, Dan Bernstein created the ED25519 signatures, and these are Schnorr signatures actually. And as far as I'm aware, this was the first widely used standard for Schnorr signatures. But this was 2011, this was several years after Bitcoin had launched. And it appears that Bitcoin used ECDSA essentially because that's what was exposed by the OpenSSL library. And in the early days, Bitcoin depended entirely on OpenSSL for all of its cryptography. So that finally brings us to like, what are Schnorr signatures and how do they benefit Bitcoin? And with that history, like maybe the answer is self-evident, which is that Schnorr signatures provide an alternate to ECDSA with very similar size and performance characteristics, but which have a much simpler structure that makes certain kinds of out-of-band protocols a fair bit easier to implement. And the big one in particular is that you can create what are called Schnorr multi-signatures in a fairly straightforward way. So with ECDSA, if you want to create a compact multi-signature, meaning a signature produced by many people that is nonetheless a single signature with a single key associated to it, you have to do some fairly heavy general multi-party computation. And there are a few papers describing how to do this, and in the last couple of years there have been a few new papers doing this much more efficiently, but it's nonetheless much more complicated than it would be for Schnorr. And as far as I'm aware, there's no production-ready implementations of this, meaning that if you want to do multi-signatures, if you want Bitcoins controlled by many signers, you have to have them all create a separate ECDSA signature and post that to the blockchain. So with Schnorr, there is a fairly, like a standard folklore way of doing this, which is actually insecure. There's a slightly modified version of the folklore version called Musig, which myself and Peter Willa and Greg Maxwell and Yannick Serin developed a year, almost 2 ago, where multiple signers can come together. They combine their public keys into a single joint public key that represents all of them. And then when they want to sign to move the coins, they do an interactive protocol, and the result is a single signature that moves coins over. So with Schnorr signatures, there's a way to create multi-signatures, and that's even threshold signatures. You could have like 2 of any 3 participants, and the 3 create a joint public key, and any pair of them can produce a signature. You can do this in a way that the resulting signature has the same size and all the same properties as just a single signer signature. You get better scalability and better privacy because you're no longer revealing than the original participants or even the number of original participants.
Okay.
Cool.
So when this is implemented, does EDCSA get stripped out or does that stay and you have both?
So we have both. So when...
Is that for backwards compatibility?
Yeah. Yeah. And there's actually, I guess in principle, it would be possible to remove ECDSA with a soft fork to Bitcoin, but there's no particular reason to do that. The way that new upgrades to Bitcoin go, and there are maybe like 2 categories of upgrades that this might be. One is there are a variety of opcodes in Bitcoin script that are defined to do nothing at all. And it's possible to give these meaning, for example, to add a new opcode that just verifies Schnorr signatures. But with Taproot, which I think we're going to get a bit deeper in, we changed a fair bit more than just adding a new signature type. We cleaned up the multi-signature process, and importantly, we changed the structure of what a output looks like and what a witness for that output looks like. And we did this using a new versioning system introduced by Segwit. So let me quickly describe how Bitcoin's transactions are structured. You have a Bitcoin transaction is a pile of inputs and a pile of outputs. The inputs are all references to old outputs. with one exception, which are the coin-based transactions, which create new coins. We can forget about those. And so there are a set of what are called UTXOs, unspent transaction outputs. And to create a new transaction, you take a bunch of those that you own. You provide a witness attesting to the fact that you actually do own those, and a witness in particular, you're both attesting that you own the coins and you are signing the transaction to prove that you are the owner and you authorize that transaction. And then that transaction destroys those UTXOs and creates new ones of equal or lesser value. And that's how transfers happen. And the UTXOs are each labeled by what's called a Bitcoin script, which describes the spending policy. So if I want to send money to you, I take coins that can only be spent by me. I destroy those, create coins that can only be spent by you. That's a transfer. So what Segwit did was introduce a new way of encoding these outputs. What we used to call the script pub key, I'm going to go with what we used to call the script pub key, is now called a witness program. And what this is the hash in Segwit v0 outputs. This is either the hash of some complicated policy, and you need to reveal the actual policy to spend it, or it's a hash of some public key. And if you want to spend those, you just reveal the public key, and then you also reveal a signature associated to that public key. And these V0 witness programs are defined to have the semantics that I just described. But Segwit actually has 16 versions. You could also have V1 witness programs, V2, V3. And the rules that Bitcoin enforces on these today are simply some length limits. I forget exactly. There's some length that they aren't allowed to exceed. And that's it. So we can soft fork in meaning to a later Segwit version, such as V1 right now has no meaning. We can say if somebody has a V1 witness program, and then that program is some sequence of bytes, now that is going to be a Taproot output. And that's how Taproot is implemented. And so now we have these two different versions of Bitcoin outputs, well, plus all of the old legacy ones that are pre-Segwit. Of these V0 ones that continue to use ECDSA, that continue to use the script that we know and love, that continue to work with all of our existing signing hardware and transaction creation software and all that good stuff. And then we have the separate V1 outputs, and those have the new semantics associated to them, and they both exist side by side.
So I guess if you were to strip out EDCSA, that's going to undo a bunch of work that's already been done on various wallets or various companies have implemented. But Schnorr gives them new tools to create new multisigs.
Correct, yeah.
Does it affect someone like myself who isn't technical, isn't building anything in my everyday use of Bitcoin? Or is this just something in the background that just makes Bitcoin better?
It will... I believe there is some, in your Segwit addresses, the BC1 addresses, I believe one character of those will change.
That's it.
That's it. That is what you will notice when you switch to a wallet that supports these new things. As a user, especially a user who simply owns their own coins and is sending their own coins around without complicated policies, it's unlikely that you would notice anything beyond that.
And will wallets have to upgrade to support this?
In order to actually use these new features, wallets will have to upgrade. Yep.
Okay, so similar at the moment, I've got a couple of wallets. Say my Ledger doesn't support Betch32 addresses at the moment,
yep.
So I get a little warning. So the same will happen with this, and there'll be an encouragement for wallets to upgrade to support.
So I'm not sure that there would be encouragement like that. So unlike the upgrade from traditional addresses to Betch32, Betch32 sort of includes support for all of these future versions of witness programs, meaning that ideally wallet software that should own and control these things will the V1 outputs will need to be upgraded, but everything else that works with them will not. So unlike the transition from the older style addresses to Betch32, there's much less of a there's much less of a reason for people to upgrade if they don't want these new features. Although, as an ordinary wallet user, it will be more efficient to spend Taproot outputs than it will be to spend V0 outputs. But the other thing, or another reason to upgrade to Betch32 from the old style addresses, is that Betch32 has error correction built into it. You can tweak up to 5 different characters in your address, and this is guaranteed to be an invalid address.
Why is that?
So the reason is that Peter Wolla, I believe using a Blockstream compute cluster, spent quite a while searching through this class of what are called linear codes. These methods of taking some data and extending it in a way that you are adding redundancy, but you're adding very structured redundancy, such that if you add, say, 5 characters of redundancy, then if 5 characters anywhere in the thing, it's not just the 5 that you added, it's not even really meaningful to say which 5 that you added, but if up to 5 characters are incorrect, then there would be no original data that would have extended to that. Like, we're sort of taking the space of valid public keys, say, for which every sequence of bytes, half of all the sequences of bytes are valid public keys, and we're extending it to a longer string. Say maybe we add 5 characters, and every character in best32 is 5 bits, so we're adding 25 bits, or 2 to the 25 times as many things. So that's 32 million times as many addresses. But we're doing so in a way that only 1 in 32 million of those are actually valid addresses.
Right, okay, so there won't be any chance that 2 addresses are very similar but 1 character difference then?
That's exactly right, yeah.
Okay, so I'll tell you where that's kind of interesting as a user. Historically, I copy and paste addresses, right?
Yeah.
And not once in the history of doing this have I ever made a mistake. But there's been a couple of times where I haven't had the copy and paste facility, and I've typed the address out as I'm reading it. I'm typing it out, and then I'm double checking, I'm triple checking. So that would reduce my fear of making a mistake when typing address out manually.
Yep, and I should emphasize, though, how so the current address scheme does actually have a checksum, but it's kind of a probabilistic checksum. So if you make any number of mistakes in typing an address, there's roughly a 1 in 4 billion chance that that one mistake will result in a valid address. And that sounds like an enormous number, of course, but when you are a merchant or somebody generating hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of addresses, and there are tens of thousands of such people, you quickly get to scales where these kind of collisions seem possible. So it's best 32. For the first 5 mistakes, you're at this like 0. There's 0 chance that anything will go wrong. And then after that, you get this kind of like 1 in 4 billion. I don't know the exact probability off the top of my head, but then you fall back to this probabilistic kind of thing after 5 mistakes. So if you actually want to demonstrate the fact that in Bitcoin you could have 2 valid addresses that are 1 character away from each other, you can do this. I did this once. It took me about 20 seconds on my laptop to generate such a pair, to make a point on RBTC to somebody about it being possible. But it's actually very unlikely that like an individual user making a few addresses a week kind of thing would be to run into that. So existing addresses are safe in practice, and I'm kind of wincing as I say that.
Is it problematic or bulky for Bitcoin to have so many different types of addresses?
So Bitcoin itself, on the blockchain layer, verifiers don't see these different kind of addresses. Verifiers do see the different kind of what are called script pub keys or witness programs. They see that there are like the old school legacy addresses that have been in the system since the beginning. They see the newer style P2SH addresses, which are the ones that start with 3. And when they see those, they need to say, oh, this is actually the hash of some script. And then they need to check that what would have been a satisfying script sig or witness for that script is actually another program. And then there's like another satisfaction attached. And they also know the rules for the V1 outputs. And then there will be new rules for the V1 Taproot outputs. So for verifiers, they have to support each one of these things, although they're fairly well isolated. Like when you add support for one, you don't have to go mess with the code for the other. They can basically, you write that code once, it works, it just sits there forever. As a wallet user, you may, when sending to different types of addresses, you may need to know how to translate that address to a script pub key. So if you see a 1 whatever address, there's a rule for doing that. If you see a 3 whatever address, there's a rule for that. And the cool thing about best32 is when you see a best32 address, there's a rule for that, but it's the same for V0, the same for V1, the same for V2, the same for every SegWit version. So as somebody who's just sending coins around, once you support sending to best32, then you support every future SegWit version whatsoever.
Right. If you were to rebuild Bitcoin Core today from scratch, would you still have a requirement for different address types, or could it be built with a single address type now?
It would have had if we could go back in time and start Bitcoin from scratch, I think we would basically just only have best32.
Okay.
We may still start with Segwit v0, and then like layer on v1 and so on, like Taproot versus non-Taproot. But these are still the same kind of address.
Yeah.
Is the important thing.
Will there become a time in the future where these old addresses will become irrelevant or redundant, or are they required because there's some part of like, because the addresses existed, that the protocol needs to be aware of them?
So I have a fun story about this. So
Amazing.
I hang out on IRC. My name is Andy Toshi. You can find me on Pound Bitcoin, on Freenode, and a few other channels. And about 6 or 12 months ago, somebody came onto IRC. They said, I'm trying to spend from an old Electrum wallet, but it's not letting me spend my coins. And I said, okay, like, can you tell me what's happening? And it seemed like Electrum was creating invalid transactions, spending these coins. And I said, like, how did you get this wallet? What's going on here? And he said, oh, well, I had a wallet from 5 or 6 years ago, and I tried to upgrade it to Electrum, to the latest version of Electrum, and it didn't really work, so I like hacked some things around, and somehow I got it to start up and produce signatures for this. And so I messaged him privately. I said, can you please show me one of the UTXOs, one of the outputs that you're spending? And I messaged him privately because you should never reveal your UTXOs in public. That's a loss of privacy, and you'll at the very least be revealing a lower bound on how many Bitcoins you're holding. But importantly, you're revealing which Bitcoins are yours, and that's like, you're just like feeding information into the chain analysis machine.
Evil chain analysis.
Oh, it's horrible. And he showed me this output, and this was a very old school output. This is actually a pay to pub key output. So this is before we had addresses, like even the one addresses that we have today, or we had like one addresses that actually had completely different semantics. And this is, I don't know the history of how this happened. It's a very Satoshi thing to do, to like associate the EC pub keys to addresses rather than script pub keys to addresses. So it used to be a long time ago, there was a type of script pub key called pay to pub key. And you would just reveal a public key, and to spend the coin, you would reveal a signature. This was supplanted by what we now use in one addresses called pay to pub key hash, where what hits the blockchain is a hash of a public key, and only when you're spending do you reveal the public key. So this is shunting data from the UTXO set, which is a set of all active coins, to kind of witness data, which is data that's necessary to validate transactions. So this changed the validation properties a little bit in favor of people maintaining this change state by making some data that was originally a semi-permanent part of the state now something kind of ephemeral. And I'm kind of waving my hands here. Segwit finally did the correct thing there, which is to actually segregate the witnesses, to move them to a separate part of the block Merkle tree, so that they could actually be validated independently. But this was the first step towards that. And because these are all one addresses, these old school things and the things that we now know as one addresses, what Electrum was doing was trying to produce a pay to pub key hash signature for a pay to pub key output, which of course is just invalid. So the result is a script that just didn't validate, an invalid transaction. And I looked at this and I'm like, what on earth where did you get this? And so I looked into my copy of the blockchain, and I looked at the UTXO that he was describing. And it was, in fact, the Genesis, the Coinbase, well, wouldn't that be cool for the Genesis transaction, right? And this was Craig Stephen Wright. No, it was the Coinbase transaction for some block around height. I'm going to say between 50 and 80,000. I know the exact height, but I don't want to
But early.
Hurt this person. Very early.
Very early.
This was from I want to say 2010.
Wow.
And he just had this old Electrum wallet just laying around, and he tried to upgrade it, and he kind of hacked it up. And so in the end, I said, can you show me the transaction spending this? And so he showed me the transaction, and I think I was actually able to munge the transaction myself in Vim using raw transactions, because that's how I use Bitcoin. That's how real hackers use Bitcoin, is opening up Vim and editing hex. And so he was able to move his coins, and I said, congratulations, don't tell anybody you have these outputs. And I'm sure he had quite a few of those, because if you had one block back then, you were probably mining quite a few blocks. Back then it was pretty easy to do on your CPU. So this whole story is, you asked, one day we'll be able to retire. Will we be able to retire these? Will these just go away? And the answer is no, because of stuff like this. There are people out there that have pretty old outputs. I have firsthand experience with outputs as old as as 50 to 80,000. But I'm sure there are even older ones out there. And the effect of removing these would be to confiscate those coins.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned, it would be like almost a false savings. Like the code to validate these is like very ossified, as stable. It will, by definition, it will never change, because any future changes will just happen in new versions, new Segwit output versions, new independent blocks of code.
So when's Schnorr come in?
So a couple days ago, Peter Wola published a draft for a BIP for a pair of things called Taproot and TapScript. And these together comprise a definition of Segwit v1 outputs that we are proposing. And this is a culmination of work over the last year and a bit, depending how you measure it, or the last 5 years, depending. Like there are different ways you can think about where we started here. So I'm going to say Taproot. Taproot started with a conversation that Greg Maxwell and Peter Wola and I had in a diner in California in January of 2008. So a little bit over a year from when we really started working.
2018.
2018. Yeah,
2008.
Yeah, sorry. Wow, I've been revealing Satoshi all over the place here.
This was the original Satoshi meeting.
Yeah, exactly. This must be what it feels like to be Craig Wright. Like, you answer every question with whoops and Satoshi, and then
So 2018 then.
Yeah, 2018. Yes.
Did you go boating that day?
There were no boats involved. I don't want to say how far away from the ocean we were, because privacy.
Yeah. Okay.
So this V1 Segwit output proposal, I guess, called Taproot, is the upgrade to Bitcoin that I expect will be the one to bring Schnorr Signatures to Bitcoin. Because alongside Schnorr Signatures, it brings a whole host of other cool benefits that I'll talk about in a moment. And so we published a draft for a BIP a couple days ago. And the draft right now is going through a bunch of revisions. A lot of people replied to us on the Bitcoin development mailing list. A lot of people replied to us in private and on IRC and stuff. So we're getting a lot of feedback from stakeholders, and the draft is changing and evolving in response to that. So it's impossible to put dates on these kind of consensus actions, but I'm going to make up a bunch of numbers for you, because people like made up dates. And I'm going to say that there's going to be a couple months probably of this kind of iteration and changes to the draft and revisions and so forth. And then we'll finally settle down into a fairly concrete proposal. And that's what will eventually be assigned a BIP number. And being assigned a BIP number is basically a way of saying this is a coherent, finished proposal. It does not say this is going to be deployed. It does not say anybody likes it. It does not mean anybody's going to use it. It just says, as an author, you say it's, kind of complete and coherent, and it's probably not going to change too much. And so once we have a BIP number, then there will be a bunch of work done on integration and actually writing. I guess alongside having a BIP number, there will be a bunch of integration type code, and then there will be a whole ton of QA cycles related to that, probably 6 or 12 months of just regular software QA. And in parallel to that, there needs to be a community discussion about, do we want to accept this BIP? Do we want this BIP to be part of the Bitcoin protocol? And if so, how do we deploy that? What is the deployment mechanism that will be used? Should we try to use the BIP 8, where you have basically technologically giving miners a veto, not politically, although we have in the past miners believed that they did in fact have a veto, and then there was a tremendous amount of controversy and political shenanigans related to that. Will we try to use that? Will we use BIP 9? Will we use some sort of user-activated soft fork, which is actually, to be clear, all soft forks are ultimately user-activated, of course. But by having miner signaling, you reduce the chances that you're going to have a chain of invalid blocks appearing that miners are producing, and perhaps some old validators who haven't upgraded will see that as valid, and that can cause quite a bit of chaos and confusion. I don't know how that's going to shake out, but that needs to be shaken out, and it wouldn't surprise me if we have 6 or 12 months of argument just on that. And then maybe if everything goes well and this lands on we really want this and we want to deploy it and the community is all gung-ho and let's actually deploy it, then we will actually do the deployment. And that requires an actual upgrade mechanism, that requires some sort of date in the future, or some block height in the future, at which point this will become active. And that itself will probably be 6 or 12 months after everyone agrees that it should be deployed.
Next up, I talked to Andrew more about some of the exciting tech upgrades coming to Bitcoin, but before that, I got a message from my show sponsors. So first up, Dropbit, the best wallet I've ever used for Bitcoin, the only wallet I actually use for Bitcoin on my mobile. I've loved it. Ever since I've downloaded it, it's been pretty cool. I must have sent maybe like 30 times I've sent Bitcoin with it now. I find it so easy, especially the other day with one of my friends who didn't have a wallet and I just used his mobile phone number. So that's super cool. As they said to me, it's like a Venmo for Bitcoin, and we don't have Venmo here in the UK. I've seen my friends out in America use it religiously, and they're kind of right. I found it really useful when I'm at conferences where you're surrounded by other Bitcoiners, just be able to send Bitcoin back and forth. So super cool wallet. Also, they sponsored my party at Consensus in New York, which is amazing. And they've just agreed to sponsor another party at Bitcoin 2019 in San Francisco. So keep an eye out for that. That should be pretty fun. But if you want to check it out, the wallet is available for iPhone and Android. Just head over to dropbit.app, which is DROPBIT.app. Next up, we're going to talk about Aurochs. It's one for you hardcore traders out there, the world's best crypto trading terminal, which is available on both Mac and PC. Have you checked it out yet? Have you downloaded it? Do you use trading terminals? It'd be great to hear from you. I'm not a hardcore trader, so I don't know about this, but I'd love to know if some of you are. I have downloaded it myself, and even though I'm not a trader, I've installed it. I've set up my Kraken board for BTC USD chart, which I have open every day now. Now the prices are back to being a good place. I think we're all a bit happier to be checking the prices more regularly. They've got a whole bunch of features, though. You can find out more on their website, but using your API keys, you can trade on up to 9 exchanges, which include Kraken. You can create advanced order types directly in the software. There is a feed curated for some of the best professionals to help you with your research. You can set up alerts with over 150 different indicators, and Aurochs can even handle custom indicators written in PineScript or JavaScript. For a 14-day free trial, head over to getaurochs.com, which is GETAUROX.com. And lastly, BlockFi again, creating the future of Bitcoin financial services. It does really excite me, some of the potential here, some of the potential of integrating the future of financial services with traditional financial services. I know myself, I just want my bank account to have my pounds and my Bitcoin next to each other. I know that would be super cool. They've got 2 products available now which you can use. They've got their interest accounts, which I am using. Definitely do your research before signing up, but I enjoy the fact that I can earn interest on my Bitcoin. I think it's super cool. You can also borrow against your crypto holdings using their crypto-backed loans, and they've got a massive announcement coming next week, which I will tell you all about on the podcast, so keep an eye out for that. But if you're interested in trying out any of BlockFi's products, head over to blockfi.com, which is BLOCKFI.com.
Can you see any reason why people would be against this? It seems like when Peter Willer put out about this, it was very popular.
Yeah. So there isn't really... This is the kind of thing where, because it's a new Segwit version, like everybody who supports sending to these things, everybody who supports sending to Bitcoin to Segwit outputs, already will support sending to these things. There's no wallet upgrade required if you don't want to actually use these things. Like, it's really something that you can just ignore if you don't care about. The additional complexity is much less than that for Segwit. So Segwit itself was actually very simple. It was moving some data from one part of the block Merkle tree to another part. The difficulty with Segwit was that because it added extra difficulties to transactions, there were changes to the peer-to-peer layer that needed to be made to communicate with old nodes and to negotiate with old nodes and say, like, will you understand if I give you this extra data? And they're like, yay or nay, except the old ones couldn't say no because they didn't know it was coming, of course. And so there was complexity of deployment around that. And we don't have any of that with this. This is really just touching the consensus layer, but the consensus layer within the existing consensus world. There's no new data, there's no new extra anything. And related to that, there are not any changes to parameters of the system, such as the block size, which happened with Segwit. Segwit increased the Bitcoin block size. And that, for those of you who were at Magical Crypto Conference a couple days ago and saw Luke's talk arguing that we should have reduced the block size many years ago, that itself is a point of contention. So all of the stated reasons for the noise around Segwit basically don't apply here. And it would surprise me very much if that kind of FUD were being spread around. Having said that, there is one point there may be a general point of opposition that you might see is people thinking we should do this slightly differently, and this sort of bike shedding and revisions and stuff. And it's plausible that like maybe we just never find a solution that everybody thinks is best. That would surprise me, because this is the kind of thing where they're like fairly minor technical compromises to be made. And when people get tired of arguing, they stop arguing about that stuff, because ultimately it doesn't really matter. There's one specific point of contention that I'm aware of, that there's been some noise about on the Bitcoin mailing list and elsewhere, which is with Taproot outputs, every output, rather than being a public key behind a hash, is now just an elliptic curve public key. Meaning if your coins are parked in a Segwit output, or a Segwit v1 output, a Taproot output, and quantum computers appear out of nowhere, then your coins could be stolen. And if you instead had a Segwit v0 output or a legacy address, that public key, the EC public key that's vulnerable to quantum computers, would instead be behind a hash, and the coins couldn't be stolen until such time as you tried to spend them. This is how the argument goes. This is wrong for a couple of reasons that are fairly non-obvious, and this is why we're having this discussion. One reason is that actually the public keys associated to about 2/3 of the Bitcoins that are out there are known. There are all these old pay-to-pub key outputs that have explicit pub keys. There are a tremendous amount of reused addresses, meaning addresses that somebody sent to, and then those coins were spent. In the process of spending, they revealed the underlying EC key. And then there are a ton of outputs that were spent on the Bcash chain in order for people to sell their Bcash for Bitcoin. And in doing so, they revealed their public key to the Bcash chain, even if they didn't reveal it to Bitcoin. And that also is a way to reveal your public key. And actually, I think a lot of people did that. Even people who don't reuse addresses kind of de facto reused an address, because when they received to that address, that turned into a joint receive of a Bitcoin and a Bcash, as long as you received before the split happened. And then there's a whole nother category of ways to reveal your public key that are not easy to measure. For example, when you communicate with a hardware wallet is doing a BIP32 derivation, and it will produce a public key that it sends to your host. So if you are communicating with a hardware wallet over some connection or whatever, it is probable that anybody who compromises your host or who is able to talk to your hardware wallet, even if they are unable to produce signatures, is very likely they'll be able to ask your hardware wallet for public keys. Ask it, like, please derive these public keys. Right now, public keys are not treated as secret data for pretty much any purpose in the Bitcoin ecosystem. And so outside of producing transactions, there are all sorts of ways to obtain public keys from signing devices that are not yet translated into addresses. And so there also, if you're worried about a quantum attacker, you better hope that nobody ever plugs your dongle into a computer or something like that. So as a result of all these things, basically all the public keys are exposed now. So maybe you are a crazy person like me who wrote their own wallet software generating like non-standard hardened BIP32 paths connected to some hardware dongle that's air-gapped using their own special wallet that has encrypted entries of fixed size for every single address they generated.
Yeah, I did that.
Yep.
Yeah,
No.
I did it this morning.
Yeah. I mean,
that's why I was kind of a little bit late.
Yep. No, it's good. It's a good exercise, right?
Yeah,
Like you want to spend 15 minutes a day writing your own wallet, and then 15 minutes meditating, and then you are ready.
No, I didn't meditate. I put the meditating off just to build this, and I'll show you afterwards.
Okay. Yeah, I'm excited to see that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if your head wasn't clear, then I'm uncertain that it will be secure. And even like if you do all these things, though, if everybody else's Bitcoins are lost, then like good for you. Like you have retained some of these tokens that are now completely worthless and unusable because
the end of
network
Bitcoin.
cares. Yeah, exactly. So the hash that exists in front of a public key, as I mentioned earlier, this is there to sort of shift some of the data retention costs from public keys, which are normative non-witness data, into witness data. It sort of shrinks the amount of data that validators are required to store in order to validate future Bitcoin transactions. But it was never intended as a quantum protection, and it doesn't function as a quantum protection. There's sort of this idea out there that it does, but it simply doesn't. And even if it did, by the way, it's very unclear how you would ever spend your coins again, because you have to reveal the public key to spend your coins. And people talk about, oh, we'll invent a quantum resistant zero knowledge proof scheme, and you reveal your public key and sign inside of a zero knowledge proof. We know how to do that. The resulting proofs are like over 100 kilobytes. So if you want to attach hundreds of kilobytes to every single one of your transactions and try to fit that in the blockchain, I mean, I guess there will be room because Bitcoin's dead.
Yeah.
But, I mean, this isn't realistic. This is not really a thing. And
Is quantum computing a genuine fear of some Bitcoins? Because I asked Luke about this, and he said he thinks we're a long way off if it's ever actually going to be possible to create quantum computers.
I think they will. I don't think it's never. A lot of people in the space do think it's never. I do think it's a long ways away. Somebody asked me about this a couple of days ago on a Monero podcast, and I said, like, I would be shocked if it was more than 15 years, and I would be surprised if it's if it's less than 15 years. I would be quite surprised if it was less than like 25. It's important that we start thinking about post-quantum systems, because if there's no preparation whatsoever done, then it doesn't matter how far in the future is, we're still going to get blindsided. So it's important now that we start working on standardization and exploring ideas and exploring what Bitcoin is going to look like in a post-quantum world.
Okay.
But right now there are no there are no candidates for post-quantum signature schemes that are good enough that it would be reasonable to deploy them in Bitcoin, given how astronomically unlikely it is that they'll be needed in the near future. And unlike some applications of cryptography, in particular, unlike encryption, Bitcoin signatures are kind of ephemeral, right? Like if we're worried like, oh, quantum computers will be around in 5 years, one day maybe we'll think that, then we need a new signature scheme and you need to move your coins to that new signature scheme, and then like problem solved, like you can stop worrying about it. Compare that to, say, if you're receiving a GPG encrypted email. Now, NSA has a copy of that email because they've tapped all of the communication lines and they're storing every encrypted email. There's nothing you can do. If they come up with a quantum computer, even if it's 30 years later, they will decrypt your email now. So if you're worried about encryption, then maybe you should be transitioning to quantum secure schemes like immediately, like as fast as you can. The reason being that you are vulnerable not only to quantum computers tomorrow, but quantum computers ever. But Bitcoin's not like that.
No.
Yeah, you're only vulnerable to quantum computers tomorrow. And as long as it's not this tomorrow, there's no need to be trying to transition.
And there's higher priorities right now.
There are higher priorities right now, and we've seen continued exciting developments in the post-quantum. Like the surface of post-quantum cryptography is just changing much too quickly anyway.
Okay. All right, so you mentioned Taproot. Another thing I've seen mentioned recently is Graftroot.
Yep.
What is Graftroot?
So Graftroot is kind of a cute thing. So associated to Taproot is something called TapScript. Let me take that. Let's just say it's all Taproot. Okay. The Taproot includes a feature called MAST, Merkle's abstract syntax trees, where all the different ways that you might spend a coin go into a giant thing called a Merkle tree. And to actually spend the coins, if you don't want to just sign with your Taproot output, you reveal one of these branches and you reveal a proof that that spending policy was actually committed to by your Taproot key, and then you reveal whatever witness you need to actually satisfy that policy. And the idea is you don't need to reveal any of the different policies that you didn't use, unlike today, where today in Bitcoin script, if you want to do such a thing, you need to write this giant if tree in Bitcoin script, and everybody downloads the whole if tree. They see all the different policies, even though you only had to use one. So this is cool, except, well, so MAST is cool compared to the status quo, like all those if trees. But it requires you know all of your signing policies, all of your spending policies up front at the time that you create the output. And if you are doing something weird, like you have billions of these, then you need to create a billion entry Merkle tree, which is computationally kind of difficult to do. So what Graftroot instead proposes, and Graftroot is not part of the Taproot proposal, let me emphasize, but let me explain what it is and why we decided not to put it into the proposal. What Graftroot lets you do is delegation. It says, rather than having a public key that secretly commits to a giant tree of all possible spending policies, we let people sign a new spending policy with the existing public key, and then that spending policy will be like activated. So now you're allowed to spend coins with that policy. And this means that to actually use a policy, you simply reveal the new policy and the signature on that policy. It doesn't matter if there are a billion trillion of these things, you just reveal one signature and one policy. So you kind of get this masked tree where you don't have to generate the whole tree at once. And the cost of revealing which branch you want to do is constant. And you can choose new policies after the fact, which is kind of cool. You have an existing output and you kind of graft. The idea is you graft on some additional spending policy. And there are two reasons that we decided not to propose this. Let me say three reasons, although the first two are kind of the same. That we decided not to bring this into the Taproot proposal. One is that there is a lot of room to iterate on the design. In particular, how do you handle reused public keys? What if I have some coins that are controlled by some public key, I sign some alternate Graftroot script, and then I have that alternate Graftroot script floating around, and then somebody later sends coins to the same public key. Should that original Graftroot script be applicable to the new one, or should it somehow be tied to individual UTXOs, or whatever? And there are a whole bunch of trade-offs. There are a whole bunch of different ways of using it that are enabled or disabled depending on what you choose there. And we don't have any clear use cases that would guide us on what choices to make there. And this brings us to my second reason, which is that it seems like however we propose this, it's kind of a foot gunny thing. Like it's possible to use in a way that has unexpected consequences. And then the third reason, and this is really the most important reason, is that a Graftroot spend or a Graftroot signature on alternate policy is basically equivalent to just signing a one input, one output transaction, which will give you the same effect, right? If you want to sign an alternate spending policy, just sign a transaction moving the coins to that spending policy. Ultimately, Graftroot is just a more efficient way of doing that that's blessed by the blockchain. And without having any clear use case or user guidance on how to make decisions about that, it seems like basically we're optimizing for something that we don't really know what it is. So for that reason, we just didn't put Graftroot in, and we've got almost no complaints to that effect. We've gotten asked many times, like, why isn't Graftroot there? But nobody said, like, I needed to use Graftroot for this, and now it's disabled. Like, argh.
Okay. Who gets to name these things?
So with Taproot, I believe this is Peter. So somehow it's always Peter Willa who comes up with names, which is weird because we all make fun of him for coming up with terrible names, but then none of us will step in and take one for the team. I believe what happened with Taproot was Peter sat down at the table at this diner, and we said, because he had stepped up for a moment while Greg and I hashed out some final details. Hashed out, get that?
There you go.
And we were like, how do we name this? And Greg said, isn't there the name of like a root that goes into the ground and it like anchors, like you can't see it, but it anchors this plant to the ground or something? And Peter said, yeah, that's a taproot. And we're like, we don't think so. So we looked it up, but sure enough, Wikipedia vindicated him. And so then it was Taproot. And then Graftroot, I think, was Greg Maxwell. I think there was a pun on Taproot related to grafting. And then we went back and forth. He was worried that people think like graft. Doesn't graft mean like, city politics, like collusion, corruption kind of thing? And I said, no, that's grift. And then it turned out it was both. Both were bad. We shouldn't have grift. Shouldn't have Griftroot.
Have you named anything?
Has anyone used my names? I don't think so. I'm trying to think what my names were. I feel like I have some really good ones. I will take credit for Griftroot. That's mine. Yeah.
So somebody who knew I was going to be interviewing you asked me to ask you about Dandelion. Now I know a bit about Dandelion. Somebody covered it might have been LOP, but it's for improving privacy, right? Mm-hmm. Can you explain how it works and then if and when it's coming to Bitcoin?
Sure. Yeah. I believe so. To answer your second question, I believe it is already in Bitcoin.
It's already in that. Okay.
I believe so. Yeah. So Dandelion is a change to the peer-to-peer layer. In particular, actually not even a change to the peer-to-peer messaging, although I think it does need some. It's a change to how transactions are propagated amongst the existing peer-to-peer network. So the problem in Bitcoin today, or Bitcoin in the recent past, is that when you create a transaction, your node broadcasts this transaction to a bunch of people, and they all broadcast the transaction to a bunch of other people, and you get kind of this like shockwave effect across the network that is easy for somebody with a fairly global view of the network to centralize the origin of that shockwave and say, this is the person who created the transaction because this is like where all the propagation of this transaction is coming from. And so as a result, transactions that are kind of unnecessarily linked to the time you created them and your IP address and like which node you connected to and all this good stuff, all this bad stuff, I should say. And there were a couple of papers demonstrating specific attacks related to this and related to the kind of timing analysis that was done. Some of the existing mitigations against this, such as Bitcoin core nodes putting random delays and stuff into propagation. So what Dandelion does is when you create a transaction, you create a sort of path, a series of nodes that you connect to. And actually, I think you only create the first part, and then the next node chooses one person to send to, sends one person to send to, sends one person to send to, and so forth. And so the idea is that you were propagating your transaction along like some specific path. And somebody who wants to figure out that you are originating the transaction would need to be on that path, which now they need like a very global, they need to pretty much have dominated the network to have a high probability of doing this. And then after some random timer, everybody along the path switches. So this is called the stem phase. The idea is this little path of like the stem of a dandelion. Then we switch at some random time, everybody along the path all at once switches to what's called the bloom phase, where now they do the original transaction blooming propagation logic, the flood network kind of thing.
Hence the name Dandelion, because it creates the stalk.
Exactly.
And then,
yeah.
Okay.
So now somebody who's trying to figure out where these transactions came from, they will get a similar looking shockwave, but now it will be centralized along a line of many nodes, which by itself will make it much harder to figure out where it comes from. But also, it's very hard to even do what I said. Like I'm giving a very visual metaphor of a shockwave here, where you can imagine like a shockwave is very clear where it came from because it's a nice circle that's going outwards. In real life, the Bitcoin network is not a circle. It's a connection of fairly densely interconnected graph of nodes that are introducing random delays and propagating things at different times and so forth. So it's actually quite difficult to just like roll back in time and say like, where did this transaction come from if you're seeing it from multiple places at once. And this is why some of the papers that spurred the invention of Dandelion and the use of Dandelion were publishable papers in their original research, was that it's not as intuitively obvious that this is possible as it was. So Dandelion works to undermine this kind of transaction graph analysis. Transaction propagation graph analysis to distinguish from the transaction graph on the blockchain.
Okay. What is the status of confidential transactions and how are they being implemented? Because I know this is being asked for a lot. People are quite keen on this.
Yeah. So confidential transactions was developed by Greg Maxwell in 2015, I believe, as a more efficient version of some proposal Adam Back had posted to the Bitcoin Talk forums back in 2013, I think, I want to say. You can Google for this. It's called like homomorphic value commitment or something, not confidential transactions back then. And this was deployed on the Elements Alpha blockchain, which has now been iterated as now the Blockstream Liquid network. And along the way, this was adopted by a variety of different projects, including privacy-focused blockchains like Monero. It's the basis of the Mimblewimble blockchain design, which
you worked on?
Yeah, I worked on a lot of the design. And one of the earlier papers, kind of turning the Voldemort paper into something more fleshed out, that came from me. And there are a couple projects out there implementing Mimblewimble. And the way that this works is that you have all of the amounts in your transactions are replaced, rather than being explicit amounts, are replaced by these objects called homomorphic commitments, which hide the amount but still let people verify that the input side of a transaction equals the output side. And people are very keen on when is this coming to Bitcoin? When is this coming to Bitcoin? And there are two broad reasons that it's not coming to Bitcoin anytime soon. One is the efficiency. So confidential transactions require replacing all these outputs with these things called Pedersen commitments, these homomorphic commitments. And associated to each Pedersen increment is this object called a range proof, which proves that it's not a negative amount. Because if you can create negative amounts, you can cancel them out and create cache out of thin air. So these range proofs are pretty big. In the original Greg Maxwell design, they were, I want to say, 128 bytes per bit or something. So we had these 32-bit range proofs showing a number between 0 and 4 billion Satoshi, meaning between 0 and about 400 something Bitcoin, I believe. And these were 2.5 kilobytes. And if you wanted to cover the entire range, you would need to do like, I think, a 52-bit range proof, which would have been about 50% larger, like close to 4 kilobytes per output, to be clear. So if you're spending a coin, even if you're just sending to one person, there's an address belonging to that person. There's also a change address going to yourself. And so you need like these 4 kilobyte outputs hanging off of each of those. And both of these would require several milliseconds for a typical verifier to handle, which is just obscene compared to the current situation where there's very little, there's almost no validation happening on the outputs. And every input has an ECDSA signature, typically just one, and those take like 60 microseconds. So you got like several hundred times as much validation time. So that situation has been greatly improved with something called bulletproofs that were developed by Dan Bonet.
They're on Monero, right?
Monero does have bulletproofs.
Yeah.
Liquid will have bulletproofs when we get around to deploying them. It's kind of funny. This is also like so many things in Monero. Bulletproofs originated from Blockstream research in part. It was actually, I shouldn't say that, it was primarily an effort of Dan Bonet and Benedict Boons and Jonathan Boodle at Stanford and University College London, with help from myself and Peter Wola and Greg Maxwell. And we at Blockstream Research did the initial implementation of Bulletproof, all of the benchmarks and stuff. That was us. We developed the way to do what's called batch verification of bulletproofs, which allows you to verify one bulletproof in a couple milliseconds. So it may be 2 or 3 times as fast as the old ones, which okay. But then multiple bulletproofs with a marginal cost of only a couple hundred microseconds. So on the order of magnitude of these signatures, as long as you're doing more than one at once. But the core idea was the folks at Stanford and UCL. And so Monero was using those in place of their range proofs, but the numbers are still not great. They're still not where they need to be for Bitcoin, I would say. Some people disagree. Luke, I'm sure, would agree with me quite strongly. It still takes several hundred bytes, which is much better than multiple kilobytes. We've got a factor of, say, 3 or 4 improvement in size, and the verification speed is much faster, but it's still not comparable to signatures. So that's the first reason that that confidential transactions, even with bulletproofs, is not coming to Bitcoin anytime soon, and that none of us who have been working on bulletproofs have taken the time to write a proposal.
Just needs a bigger breakthrough then?
Yeah, and we've seen a series of breakthroughs, so maybe there will be some series of breakthroughs that bring us there for efficiency reasons.
It's coming to Litecoin.
I hear. Plausible. I've heard. I've been requested to help work on this by Charlie Lee and others at various points, which I have not. I'm not sure where they're going to find the manpower to do that.
Yeah.
But
how do you feel about working on other chains? Do you feel like it's good because it will get it out in the wild to be used on another chain?
So let's not forget that I'm still talking about the reasons not to bring it to Bitcoin. But let me answer that first.
Sorry.
It depends a lot. So I don't work on any other chains under my name. You can see, like, if you look at the Git repo, even for things that people believe that I'm working on and that people speculate that I'm working on, or like the press incorrectly reports that I'm working on, you won't find my name on any commits for those things, except possibly commits to Bitcoin that happened before these projects forked off. Having said that, I often give advice and chat with people working on other things, such as the folks behind Grin or the folks behind Monero. And we have a lot of friends at the Zcash Foundation who we work and we share ideas, and actually we get ideas from each other. This is not just like me helping. This is actually a collaborative process, especially with folks like Sean Bowie and Dyra Hopwood at the Zcash Foundation helping with zero-knowledge proof design. And so as researchers, we're very collaborative. In terms of actively developing these alternate chains, I don't do this for two reasons. One is just in practice, I don't have the time to work on these things. I have the time to give like drive-by contributions, but then I don't have the time to convince myself that they're secure or they're robust or that they're to the level of quality that is necessary for my work on Bitcoin and my work on Blockstream's products. And that could potentially be very embarrassing for me if I were to do things and then they were broken. And the second reason is that I am very uncomfortable with the moral hazard and the incentives surrounding alternate cryptocurrencies and these alternate blockchains having their own associated token. And unfortunately, we're in a world where if I work on any of these projects visibly, that could be seen as an endorsement, not of the technology, but of the token. Mm-hmm. And that is something I very much do not want to do. And I do not endorse any tokens except for Bitcoin. But it's very difficult to work on things. And even sometimes it's difficult to collaborate without people inferring some sort of endorsement.
Well, at least you're not on Twitter where you would be destroyed for it.
Yes.
People would kill you.
I still am. People send me links of people saying things about me, and then I call my friends who are on Twitter and say, "Well, you reply for me." And
tell that motherfucker to shut up. All right, there's one other thing I want to ask you about while we're here, then I'm going to let you get back onto your work. Did you see the Microsoft announcement yesterday?
I did, and I met one of the folks at your party here in New York.
Daniel.
Daniel, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I interviewed Daniel yesterday.
Yep.
How do you feel about the Bitcoin blockchain being used for things which are non-financial transactions?
Yep. So Daniel actually asked me the same question.
I asked Daniel the same question.
Yeah. So the way that Microsoft is using the Bitcoin blockchain is as an anchor or as a timestamp for a tremendous pile of these identity, I don't want to say tokens, but these identifiers of some sort. And the way they are doing so is that they take tens of thousands of these things and they collapse them into a Merkle tree. And then they publish a single transaction with a commitment, with a 32-byte commitment to that Merkle tree. And this is a similar thing that's done by Open Timestamps, for example, which is a project run by Peter Todd, which is tremendously useful, by the way, if you're not timestamping everything. Every time someone sends you an email, every time someone sends you a tweet, just timestamp it.
Well, actually, I found out from Peter the other day, though, that people think if they just at the Open Timestamp Twitter account, that actually creates a timestamp, and it doesn't.
Oh my goodness! Yeah, don't do that. Download the Open Timestamp software and run it, and it will actually put a commitment in the Bitcoin blockchain for you. So to answer your question about people using the chain for non-financial things like this, my view is that Open Timestamps and Microsoft's projects and a few other similar things are being very non-abusive and very I don't like using the chain for non-financial things in principle. But these projects are using on the order of kilobytes a day of data. Unlike some other projects that I will not name, but which are strongly associated with Roger Ver, which try to do similar open, not open, just like timestamping things, where every single document they want to timestamp, they create a separate transaction on the Bitcoin blockchain. So they're just like loading it with these thousands of 32-byte hashes. That is incredibly abusive. It's using a tremendous amount of space for things that are not financial. It's driving up fee prices. It's driving up rates for people who are using Bitcoin for financial things. It means that people like myself who are running nodes because we care about the robustness and continuation of the network are required to validate these things, which we aren't interested in validating. And worst of all, it's completely unnecessary, even for what they're doing. Because you can accumulate these things, you can easily get tens of thousands or million X efficiency improvements just by aggregating into these hashes. And pretty much every application of blockchain, like publication kind of stuff, most things don't need publication, most things need anchoring. And you can do that with this technique of embedding a hash. And so the resulting space usage is very, very small. It could be reduced to zero, actually, using a technique called signed a contract that I believe Greg Maxwell developed. But the difference between the amount of space they're using now and zero is already pretty small. So while I would like them to reduce it to zero, I don't feel very strongly about it, and I commend them for demonstrating that it's possible to do this, 10,000x aggregation. And I wish that everybody else throwing shit on the Bitcoin blockchain would do the same thing.
Brilliant. That's a great way to end things. Just remind people how they can stay in touch with you, especially if you're not on Twitter.
So I found a new trick. I'm here at Consensus in New York, and I'm constantly being accosted by people who aren't even in the industry, just trying to vaguely network with buzzword type things. And I tell them, you can find me on LinkedIn. And this is true. If you Google me on LinkedIn, you'll find me. I don't know my LinkedIn password. I haven't known it for years. But they do, and they go away, and I don't have to deal with them. But perhaps your listeners I have a little bit more respect for.
Okay.
So I will tell them. There are two main ways. Well, one is email, I guess. But the main way is I am Andy Toshi on IRC.
Okay.
I'm on Pound Bitcoin. I'm on a few other related channels. You can also find me walking around the streets of Austin, Texas.
Where you accept beer.
Yes, where I accept beer.
Which you accepted on Sunday night.
That is correct.
What beer
yes,
did.
yeah. So that's the Peter McCormick. I had a fun. Someone was asking me about you the other
what?
day, and I blanked on your name, and I said Paul McCartney. I thought you might like that.
It's become that show's become the first one I send people to now. When people are like, "Oh, which show should I listen to?" I say, "Listen to the Andrew Poelstra one because it's a really good combination of fun and tech." Like the tech goes way over me, but explained in a way that I can maybe get to grips with it. But it's just a really fun episode, and it was so warmly received.
Cool.
I actually had an idea while we're here. Do you know what we should do sometime? And maybe I'll come to Austin and do that. I think we should do a whiteboard session and get a video camera, and you explain to me how Bitcoin works, how do UTXOs work, how Node works, how the miners, like a real whiteboard session. I think people would love that.
Yeah, we could absolutely do that. You can come. I've got room in my apartment. I've got a whiteboard on my wall. And
You got a big whiteboard?
Yeah.
Right, so I'll get the camera and we'll make this happen.
Yeah.
All right, well, listen, thanks for coming on.
Yeah.
Good to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to see you as well.
Okay, so how was that? How great is Andrew? It's so awesome having him on the show. I would happily say now he has the freedom of the podcast. If he ever wants to come on, he has an open, permanent invite. He's just the easiest person to interview, and I always enjoy it. Also, people have mentioned a few times recently that I keep going on about that I'm not technical, and why do I keep going on about this, blah, blah, blah. Okay, listen. The podcast has always been designed for new people like me who don't understand the technical side of things and who have an interest in Bitcoin. And we're always advised not to invest in things we don't understand, but there are many who don't fully understand or grasp the technical side of Bitcoin. I won't ever know which is someone's first show, the first one they'll listen to. Therefore, I will always mention that I'm not technical because I want the listener, if it's their first show, to understand that and then know the show might be there for them. So that's why I keep repeating this. And also, sometimes I do ask questions I know the answer to, but I just think it's worth putting the question out there so the listener can hear the answer. So yeah, so there's that. As ever, I think Andrew did an amazing job at explaining some of these really technical upgrades to Bitcoin. For me, it was also great to understand about the different types of addresses because in using different wallets, I've had experiences where I can't send from one to the other. So for example, I couldn't send to a Betch32 address. I didn't understand why, and it turns out it's that the wallet I had didn't support it. So yeah, that was helpful to me to hear and understand. And as I say, it's always great to catch up with Andrew. And we discussed the idea of perhaps doing a whiteboard day one day, which I really like the thought of, just having him with a whiteboard explaining some of the deeper ways about how Bitcoin works. So hopefully I'll get to do that in the future. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And if you want to support the show, there's a whole bunch of things you can do. I'm just going to rattle through these quickly. Firstly, just listen to the adverts. It's the sponsors that pay for me to do this. It's because of them I'm able to travel to all these locations and do these interviews in person, which I think are always better when they're done in person. You can become a patron. Head over to patreon.com/whatbitcoindid. You can subscribe to an ad-free version of the show for $5 a month. If you don't want to use Patreon, you can subscribe by crypto. Just email me. I'll explain how you can do that. You can become a show sponsor, although I've only got one slot left actually at the moment. So yeah, if you're interested, reach out to me. I'll see if we can figure something out. You can leave me a review on iTunes or click on the subscribe button. Both help with the show rankings in iTunes. You can follow me on social media. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Medium. My handle on everything is What Bitcoin Did. But Twitter, I do have a personal account, which is at Peter McCormack. DMs are always open. Just don't send me any nonsense. You can check out my website, which is whatbitcoindid.com. Loads of stuff on there. You can sign up to my newsletter and you can share the show out with friends and family. Anyway, loads more interviews to get through in the next week. I've got Travis Kling from Ikigai, I've got Phil Potter and Pete Rizzo from CoinDesk. So hopefully they will all be out with you next week. If you've got any questions, if you want to reach out to me, my email address is hello@whatbitcoindid.com.